Wyoming Territory, 1877. The vast emptiness of the frontier stretched beneath an endless blue sky. Jackson Blackwood rode alone across his land, the hooves of his thoroughbred stallion thundering against the hard earth. The animal, a magnificent beast worth more than most men earned in 5 years, moved with practiced precision under his master's confident hand. Jackson himself cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and hardship despite his considerable wealth. At 42, Jackson Blackwood had built an empire from nothing. The Sundown Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land, home to thousands of head of cattle and dozens of employees. His personal fortune, amassed through shrewd investments and an almost supernatural ability to multiply money, had made him a legend throughout the territory. Yet for all his material success, Jackson remained a solitary figure. The grand house at the center of his ranch stood as a monument to what he had lost. His wife Eleanor and daughter Catherine, both claimed by the fever epidemic 7 years prior. The morning had begun like any other. Jackson had risen before dawn, taken breakfast alone in his study, and decided to ride the boundaries of his eastern property. He preferred to inspect his holdings personally, despite employing a small army of capable hands. It was during these solitary rides that he felt closest to the man he had once been, a Union Army surgeon who had saved countless lives during the war before turning his formidable intellect to business. The sound reached him as he crested a small rise, gunshots echoing across the valley, followed by a human cry quickly silenced. Jackson pulled his stallion to a halt, listening. The frontier remained a lawless place in many respects. Bandit attacks were not uncommon, especially on the lonely roads between settlements. For a moment he considered turning back. Whatever trouble lay ahead was not his concern. The sheriff in Redemption could handle it. Yet something compelled him forward. Perhaps it was the doctor in him, the man who had once sworn an oath to preserve life. Or perhaps it was simply that on this particular morning, the emptiness of his existence weighed more heavily than usual. Either way, Jackson urged his mount forward, following the sound across the rolling hills. The wagon came into view as he reached the next ridge. It lay broken in a small gully, one wheel shattered, its contents scattered across the ground. Bodies were visible even from this distance. 5 of them, sprawled in the unnatural positions of the violently dead. Jackson approached cautiously, his hand moving to the custom silver-chased Colt revolver at his hip. The scene told its story plainly to his experienced eyes. A family, perhaps, or travelers together. Their wagon ambushed, robbed, and left for the buzzards already beginning to circle overhead. Blood had dried black against their clothes, their sightless eyes staring at the vast Wyoming sky. Jackson removed his hat, a gesture of respect to the dead. The doctor in him noted the precision of the killing shots, the methodical nature of the slaughter. Movement on the horizon caught his attention. 3 riders heading south at speed. Without conscious thought, Jackson's hand moved to his revolver. 7 years since he'd fired at another human being. 7 years since he'd even drawn his weapon with intent. Yet his body remembered. The Colt roared 3 times in rapid succession. At this distance, most men would have been firing blindly. Jackson Blackwood was not most men. The first rider jerked backward and tumbled from his saddle. The second clutched at his shoulder but managed to stay mounted. The third simply disappeared behind a rise, either ducked low or fallen. Jackson watched dispassionately, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse. Justice delivered in the only currency such men understood. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the dry earth as he approached the wagon. Death had visited hours ago, the bodies already cooling in the morning sun. His physician's instinct led him to check each victim, confirming what he already knew. No survivors among those visible. A man, a woman, what appeared to be a hired hand, and 2 guards. All armed, all killed with ruthless efficiency. Something caught his eye beneath the overturned wagon. A small movement, barely perceptible. Wary of wounded bandits, Jackson approached carefully, his revolver ready. Crouching down, he peered into the shadow beneath the splintered wood. A child stared back at him, perhaps 6 years old, a girl with blonde hair and eyes the color of the summer sky. Her dress was torn, face smudged with dirt, and tears long dried. She clutched a corn-husk doll to her chest with white-knuckled intensity, her gaze vacant, unseeing. Shock, his medical mind supplied automatically. The child had witnessed unspeakable violence and retreated into herself. "Can you hear me?" Jackson asked, his voice rusty from disuse. He received no response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement in those empty blue eyes. The resemblance to Catherine struck him with physical force. His daughter had been about this age when the fever took her, with the same golden hair, the same delicate features. Something long dormant stirred in Jackson's chest, cracking the armor he had built around himself since burying his family. He knelt, offering his silver canteen. "It's water. You must be thirsty." The child blinked once, twice, then reached with a trembling hand. She drank without looking at him, still clutching the doll. Jackson scanned her carefully for injuries, finding none visible, though her clothes were filthy and torn. "My name is Jackson," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "I have a ranch not far from here, a safe place." The girl remained silent, but her eyes finally focused on his face. Jackson made a decision then, one that would alter the course of his carefully ordered existence. He held out his hand to her, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. "Would you like to come with me?" It was the first time he'd spoken such words to a child in 7 years. For a long moment, the girl simply stared at his outstretched hand. Then, still clutching her doll, she placed her small palm in his. Jackson felt something shift inside him, an emotion he couldn't immediately name. He removed his expensive riding coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders before lifting her gently. She weighed almost nothing, this small survivor. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, one arm securing her tiny frame. "I won't let go," he promised quietly. "I have the means to protect you, whatever comes." The child said nothing but leaned back slightly against his chest as the horse began to move. The gesture, so small and yet so trusting, tightened Jackson's throat with unexpected emotion. Sundown Ranch appeared on the horizon after an hour's ride, a sprawling collection of buildings dominated by a 2-story mansion built in the Southern plantation style, an architectural anomaly in the Wyoming territory. White-painted fences enclosed paddocks where prize horses grazed. Beyond, cattle dotted the landscape to the horizon, a living testament to Jackson Blackwood's wealth. Workers stopped their tasks as Jackson rode in with the child, surprise evident on their faces. Their employer rarely brought visitors to the ranch, and never children. Jackson ignored their curious glances, riding directly to the main house where Isaiah Freeman emerged onto the porch. Isaiah was a tall black man with intelligent eyes and the powerful build of someone who worked the land. A former slave who had fought for the Union, he now served as Sundown's ranch manager, paid more than any comparable position in the territory. The arrangement raised eyebrows among Jackson's peers, but he cared little for their opinions. Isaiah was simply the best man for the job. "Mr. Blackwood," Isaiah said, his expression shifting from welcome to concern as he took in the child in Jackson's grim countenance. "Trouble?" "Bandits," Jackson replied, dismounting carefully while still holding the girl. "Found her at a wagon attack about 10 miles east. The rest didn't make it." Isaiah's eyes narrowed, then moved to the horizon where Jackson had come from. "You see who did it? 3 riders heading south. They won't be causing any more trouble." Isaiah nodded once, understanding the implications. He'd known Jackson long enough to recognize when the former surgeon had stepped back into his wartime role. "Victoria's inside," Isaiah said, referring to the ranch's housekeeper. "I'll have someone fetch the doctor from town." Jackson shook his head. "No need for Fletcher yet. I can examine her. She appears uninjured, just in shock." He paused. "We'll need to inform Sheriff Haynes. The bodies will need proper burial." "I'll ride to Redemption myself," Isaiah offered. The main house of Sundown Ranch reflected its owner's complex nature. The exterior maintained a certain frontier pragmatism despite its grand scale, but the interior spoke of old-world luxury. Polished hardwood floors stretched beneath expensive Turkish rugs. The furniture, much of it shipped at considerable expense from New York and Europe, combined elegance with the comfort Jackson preferred. Oil paintings adorned the walls, landscapes primarily, depicting places Jackson had visited in his younger, more carefree days. Victoria Hernandez appeared in the entryway as they entered, wiping her hands on her apron. The Mexican woman had served as housekeeper at Sundown for over a decade, beginning when Jackson's wife was still alive. She had stayed through the darkest days after their deaths, maintaining the household with quiet efficiency when Jackson himself had barely been functioning. Her eyes widened at the sight of the child. Dios mío, she whispered, crossing herself. The expression of shock quickly transformed to one of purpose as she assessed the situation. Prepare a bath and something to eat, Jackson instructed, and make up the blue guest room. Victoria nodded, already moving toward the kitchen to heat water. Jackson carried the girl into the parlor, setting her gently on a velvet-upholstered settee. She seemed overwhelmed by the surroundings, her eyes darting from the crystal chandelier to the grand piano to the massive stone fireplace. This is my home, Jackson said, kneeling to meet her eye level. You're safe here. Victoria returned with a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey. She knelt before the child, offering the drink with a gentle smile. What is your name, Pequeña? She asked. The girl stared blankly, still clutching her doll. She hasn't spoken, Jackson explained. Found her beneath the wagon. The rest, he didn't need to finish. While Victoria helped the girl bathe, Jackson retreated to his study where he kept his whiskey. The ritual was familiar. Pour 2 fingers of expensive bourbon, drink it in one swallow, feel the burn replace the ache in his chest. He'd been doing it nightly for 7 years. Tonight he stopped with the glass halfway to his lips. In the other room he could hear water splashing gently, Victoria's soft Spanish murmurings. He set the untouched whiskey down and walked to the window, staring out at his land as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The decision to bring the child here had been impulsive, uncharacteristic for a man who calculated each business move with chess-like precision. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. When he returned to the parlor, Victoria had dressed the girl in one of Catherine's old nightgowns, retrieved from the carefully preserved trunk in the attic. The fabric had yellowed slightly with age but remained clean and fine, made from the best linen money could buy. The child sat at the dining table, eating the stew Victoria had prepared, her movements mechanical as if remembering the motions of normal life. Jackson sat across from her, watching. Her hair, now clean, was the color of wheat in sunlight. Despite the circumstances, there was a natural grace to her movements, a resilience that spoke of good breeding and care before the tragedy. Tomorrow we'll go to town, Jackson said. Find someone who can take proper care of you. The girl's hand paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth, her eyes so blue, so much like Catherine's, lifted to his face. No. The word hung in the air between them, small but firm, her first utterance since he'd found her. No, Jackson repeated, surprised. I stay with you. Her voice was clear despite its disuse, her eyes suddenly fierce with determination. You said I could come home with you. Jackson felt something shift inside him. What's your name? He asked instead of arguing. The girl set down her spoon deliberately. Sophie. The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. Not his Catherine, but another girl with eyes that seemed to see right through him, cutting past the wealth and power to the lonely man beneath. I'm not the right person to care for a child, he said quietly. You saved me, Sophie replied simply, as if that settled everything. Just until we find somewhere proper for you, Jackson found himself saying. Someone who knows how to care for a little girl. Later, after Sophie had been put to bed in the blue guest room, Jackson stood in the hallway, listening to the house settling around him. Victoria appeared beside him. What will you do with her? The housekeeper asked directly. In anyone else, Jackson might have considered the question impertinent, but Victoria had earned the right to speak her mind in this household. Take her to town tomorrow. The sheriff will know who to contact. Victoria studied him, her dark eyes knowing. She has your daughter's eyes, she said softly. Don't, Jackson warned. They both knew she didn't mean Sophie. That night, for the first time in years, Jackson dreamed. Not the usual nightmares of battlefield hospitals or Catherine's fevered face, but confused images of wagons and small hands reaching for his. He woke calling out a name, not Catherine's, but Maxwell. He sat upright in bed, heart pounding, the dream already fading. Morning brought clarity and routine. Jackson rose at dawn as always, dressed in clothes that cost more than most men earned in a month, and descended to break his fast. He was surprised to find Sophie already at the breakfast table, still in Catherine's nightgown, her corn-husked doll clutched to her chest. Good morning, she said, suddenly formal. Jackson nodded, taking his accustomed place at the head of the table. Victoria served them eggs, bacon, and fresh-baked bread, hovering nearby with unusual attentiveness. "I spoke with Isaiah," Jackson said, after several minutes of silence. "He'll accompany us to town after breakfast." Sophie didn't respond immediately, focused on cutting her food with careful precision. Finally, she looked up. "Will they take Sarah too?" Jackson frowned, confused. "Sarah. My doll." Sophie held up the corn husk figure. "Mama made her for me." "Your doll?" "Of course," Jackson replied, still adjusting to hearing her speak in complete sentences. The shock must be wearing off, his medical mind supplied. He hesitated, then asked gently, "Do you remember what happened to your mom and papa, Sophie?" A shadow passed across the child's face. "The bad men came. Papa tried to fight. Mama hid me under the wagon and told me not to make a sound, no matter what I heard." Jackson nodded, impressed by her composure despite the horror she'd witnessed. "You were very brave." Sophie looked down at her plate. "The other place didn't let me keep Sarah. They said toys were for good children." Jackson felt a chill. "What other place, Sophie?" The girl's face closed off. "The place before Mama and Papa found me." Before Jackson could question her further, Isaiah appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood, a word." Jackson excused himself and followed Isaiah onto the porch. The ranch manager handed him a small bundle found in the saddlebags recovered from the attacked wagon. Inside was a child's dress, a hairbrush, and a folded piece of paper. Jackson opened it, revealing a letter addressed to someone named Judge Maxwell. The contents made his blood run cold. Allegations of a child trafficking operation, references to evidence, and warnings about children in danger. The signature was smeared, illegible. "Judge Maxwell," Jackson murmured, the name from his dream suddenly real in his hands. Isaiah's expression darkened. "You know that name?" "Judge William Maxwell, Confederate sympathizer," Jackson said quietly. "His son, Nathaniel Crawford, runs the bank in Redemption now." Isaiah's jaw tightened. Then maybe that attack wasn't random. "She said something about the place before," Jackson shared, lowering his voice. "Said they wouldn't let her keep her doll. Orphanage maybe, or something worse." They both knew what worse could mean in the territories. Children sold or indentured, working in conditions little better than slavery. Jackson folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "I'll ask around town quietly," Isaiah suggested. When Jackson returned to Sophie, she was standing by the window, looking out at the ranch hands going about their morning chores. She turned as he entered, her expression solemn. "Please don't leave me there," she whispered, and the words pierced Jackson's carefully constructed armor. "I won't leave you anywhere you're not safe," he promised. "That's all I can say for now." Redemption had grown since Jackson first arrived 7 years ago. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a main street with a bank, general store, saloon, and even a small schoolhouse. Jackson's investments had helped build much of it, though he rarely took credit publicly. People nodded to him as he rode down the main street, Sophie perched before him on his saddle, Isaiah following on his own mount. Few approached. Jackson Blackwood's wealth commanded respect, but his reclusiveness since losing his family had built a wall between him and the townsfolk. The presence of a child on his saddle drew curious glances, whispers behind hands. Sheriff Thomas Haynes looked up in surprise as Jackson entered his office, Sophie's hand held firmly in his. Haynes was a competent lawman, neither corrupt nor particularly imaginative, which made him reliable, if not exceptional. "Blackwood," Haynes said, rising from his desk, "twice in 1 month. Must be a record." His eyes moved to Sophie. "And who might this be?" "Found her yesterday with a massacred wagon train about 15 miles east," Jackson said. "She's the only survivor." Haynes nodded, straightening. "I'll send a deputy out to bring into the bodies." "Any idea who did it?" "3 men heading south. I dealt with them." Jackson's tone made it clear no further questions were necessary. The sheriff's eyebrows rose, but he asked no more about the fate of the attackers. "Well, now we'll need to find a place for the young lady." "That's why we're here," Jackson confirmed, though part of him had begun to question that certainty. Haynes scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Mrs. Reed at the school might take her in temporarily. She's got a soft spot for children in need." "Mrs. Reed?" Jackson asked. "Abigail Reed, widow. Runs the school now. She's good people. As they turned to leave, Haynes called after them. Blackwood, word of advice. Nathaniel Crawford's been asking questions about you lately. Might want to watch your back. Jackson stiffened. What kind of questions? Haynes shrugged. Where your property lines run, that sort of thing. You know he's been buying up land all around these parts. Jackson nodded tersely. Thanks for the warning. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple white building with a bell tower. Inside, Abigail Reed was writing on the blackboard. She turned at their entrance, and Jackson found himself looking at one of the most striking women he had ever seen. Abigail Reed was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical but becoming style. Her intelligent green eyes assessed them quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to professional composure. She wore a simple dress that somehow managed to be both practical and flattering. Can I help you? She asked, her voice warm but confident. Jackson removed his hat. Jackson Blackwood. Sheriff Haynes suggested I speak with you. Recognition flashed in her eyes. Mr. Blackwood, of course, the businessman and rancher. If his wealth impressed her, she hid it well. Her attention shifted to Sophie, her smile genuine. And who is this? Sophie, Jackson said. I found her yesterday. Her family was killed by bandits. Miss Reed's smile faltered, her eyes filling with sympathy, doing, Oh, you poor dear. She knelt to Sophie's level. Are you all right, Sophie? The girl moved slightly closer to Jackson, not answering. Sheriff Haynes thought you might be able to help, Jackson continued. She needs somewhere to stay until we can contact relatives or make other arrangements. Abigail studied Sophie thoughtfully. She seems attached to you, Mr. Blackwood. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. I found her, that's all. Mrs. Reed stood. I would be happy to help, but my quarters are very small. Perhaps she would be more comfortable staying with you, at least for now. I could come by daily to check on her, bring some proper clothes and books. Before Jackson could respond, the door opened again. Nathaniel Crawford entered, his presence immediately filling the room. His blonde hair and beard were immaculately groomed, his smile practiced and charming. Though not as wealthy as Jackson, Crawford had built the bank into a formidable institution, extending his influence throughout the county. Mrs. Reed, I hope I'm not interrupting, Crawford said, then noticed Jackson and Sophie. Blackwood, what a surprise. Crawford, Jackson acknowledged stiffly. The two men had a history of cordial antagonism, competing for land and influence in the growing territory. Crawford's eyes moved to Sophie, a strange expression crossing his face. And who is this lovely young lady? A child in need of shelter, Mrs. Reed answered. Mr. Blackwood found her after a tragic incident. Crawford's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. How fortunate she found such a capable protector. He approached Sophie, who shrank back against Jackson. What's your name, child? Sophie said nothing, her hand finding Jackson's and squeezing tight. Her name is Sophie, Jackson replied. Sophie Harrison, we believe. Crawford's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Harrison, you say? From where? We don't know yet, Jackson replied, suddenly on alert. Why do you ask? Crawford waved dismissively. Just curious, always looking to help those in need. He turned to Mrs. Reed. I came to discuss the school expansion. Perhaps we could speak in private. Mrs. Reed glanced between them. Of course, Mr. Blackwood, why don't you bring Sophie by tomorrow? I'll have some books and clothing ready. As they departed, Jackson felt Crawford's eyes on his back. Something about the banker's interest in Sophie left him deeply uneasy. Outside, Isaiah waited with the horses, his expression questioning. Anything? Jackson asked quietly. Isaiah nodded. People talk. There have been rumors about children gone missing, not just here, but all through the territory. Most from poor families, immigrants, folks who can't make too much noise. Like Victoria's son, Jackson remembered. 8 years ago, Victoria's 10-year-old boy had disappeared while playing near the creek that ran through Redemption. Despite Jackson funding an extensive search, no trace had ever been found. Just like that, Isaiah confirmed. And now this. He nodded towards Sophie, who stood nearby, staring at the schoolhouse. He knows something, Jackson said. Crawford, the way he reacted to her name. What are you thinking? Jackson looked down at Sophie, then back at the schoolhouse where Crawford remained with Mrs. Reed. I'm thinking we need to be very careful. and I'm thinking Sophie stays at sundown until we know more. That night, after Sophie had been fed and put to bed, Jackson examined the letter found in the wagon. The allegations were serious. Children taken, families told they died of illness, some sold to mining operations in Colorado territory, others sent further west. Most damning of all, financial records apparently linked Crawford to the operation. Isaiah entered, his expression grave. Victoria said you'd want to know. The girl, Sophie. She has a mark on her shoulder. Looks like a brand. Jackson's blood ran cold. A brand, like cattle? Isaiah nodded grimly. Or slaves. Crawford, Jackson said. The C could stand for Crawford. Or worse, Isaiah said bluntly, children taken for worse purposes than labor. Before Jackson could respond, a scream tore through the house. High, terrified, unmistakably Sophie's. Jackson raced to the guest room. Sophie thrashed on the bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. No, no, don't put me back in the dark, she cried. Jackson gathered her into his arms. Sophie, wake up. You're safe. You're safe now. Sophie's eyes flew open, wild with terror. For a moment, she struggled against him. Then recognition dawned. Mr. Blackwood? Jackson, he corrected gently. I'm here. It was just a dream. Sophie collapsed against him, her small body racked with sobs. They were putting me back in the cellar with the other children. It was dark and cold and... She broke off, unable to continue. Jackson held her, rocking slightly, as he had once done with Catherine. No one's going to put you anywhere, Sophie. I promised, remember? I won't leave you somewhere you're not safe. Will you stay? She asked, her voice small. Until I fall asleep again? I'll stay, he promised. Jackson began to tell her a story about stars guiding lost travelers home. As he spoke, he felt Sophie relax beside him, her breathing deepening as she drifted toward sleep. When she was finally asleep, Jackson moved to the door. In the moonlight, he could almost believe it was Catherine sleeping there. But it wasn't Catherine. It was Sophie, another child who needed protection. What am I doing? He whispered to the darkness. But he already knew the answer. He was opening a door he had sworn to keep shut, letting in light and pain and the terrifying possibility of loss again. And somehow it felt like the first right thing he had done in 7 years. In the hallway, Jackson paused at Catherine's door, one he hadn't opened in years. Slowly, he turned the knob and entered. Moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the small bed, the shelf of toys, the rocking horse. Dust covered everything. Victoria had been forbidden to clean in here. He moved to the dresser where a photograph stood. Catherine at 4, smiling broadly. Beside it lay a small wooden box, intricately carved. Jackson opened it, revealing a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon. Catherine's hair, cut after her death as a remembrance. For 7 years, he had come to this room to punish himself. Tonight it felt different. Tonight he saw not just loss, but the life that had been. Catherine's laughter, her curiosity, her fierce little spirit, so like Sophie's. Jackson closed the box gently and left the room, closing the door behind him. But for the first time, he didn't lock it. The next morning, Sophie joined Jackson for breakfast, dressed in one of Catherine's old dresses that Victoria had altered overnight. The child seemed different today, more present, her eyes clear and watchful. I have nightmares too, she said suddenly, between bites of porridge. About the cellar. What cellar, Sophie? Jackson asked gently. Sophie's hands tightened around her doll. Where they kept us, before Mama and Papa found me. Who kept you there? Bad men. They said we were special, that we'd go to new homes. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Some children never came back. How did your Mama and Papa find you? Jackson asked, keeping his tone conversational, despite the horror building within him. They came at night. Mama said she'd been looking for me for a long time. Sophie's face brightened slightly. They took me away in a wagon. We traveled at night, hid during the day. Mama said we were going to a place called Wyoming where a good judge would help us. The judge they were taking you to, did they ever say his name? Sophie frowned in concentration. Maxwell. They said he used to be friends with Papa before the war. The men who kept you and the other children, did you ever hear a name or see anyone important who came to visit? Sophie's face clouded. There was a man who came sometimes. The other men called him Mr. Crawford. He picked which children would leave. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I saw him yesterday at the school. Jackson felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Crawford had recognized Sophie. He knew exactly who she was and what she had witnessed. The banker's power in redemption suddenly seemed far more sinister. Sophie, Jackson said, his decision made. How would you like to stay here with me? Not just for now, but for longer. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? You won't send me away? No, Jackson said firmly. I won't send you away. This can be your home for as long as you need it to be. I have the means to protect you, whatever comes. Sophie threw her arms around his neck. Thank you, she whispered. Over her shoulder, he saw Victoria watching, tears in her eyes. Later, Jackson told Isaiah, we're keeping her, at least until this business with Crawford is resolved. I figured as much after last night, Isaiah replied. She's in danger, isn't she? Crawford recognized her. She was one of the children in his trafficking operation before her parents rescued her. Jackson's voice was cold with fury. She mentioned a cellar where they kept the children. Any idea where that might be? Isaiah considered. Crawford owns property all over the county. There are rumors about an old mining operation near the river, supposedly closed years ago, but people have seen wagons coming and going at odd hours. Jackson nodded, his mind made up. I'm going into town today. I need to speak with Mrs. Reed about school books for Sophie. Isaiah's eyes held concern. Be careful. Crawford's not a man to cross lightly. Neither am I, Jackson replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the silver revolver at his hip. For years, he had used his wealth for simple comforts, for isolation. Now he had found a purpose for it, a cause worthy of the fortune he had built. Sophie appeared in the doorway, Catherine's dress hanging slightly loose on her thin frame. Are we going to town? Jackson looked at her, this child who had survived horrors, yet still stood straight and proud. Yes, he said, and then we have work to do, important work. Sophie nodded solemnly, understanding in her two old eyes. Jackson Blackwood, millionaire rancher, felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years, a fierce determination to protect what was his. And somehow, in less than 2 days, Sophie had become exactly that. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office when Jackson, Sophie, and Isaiah arrived in Redemption the following morning. Jackson reined in his stallion, the animal's coat gleaming in the morning sun like polished copper. The fine English saddle and silver-worked bridle caught the light, silent testaments to their owner's wealth. Sophie sat before him, wearing a dress Victoria had altered overnight from Catherine's old clothing, simple but of quality far beyond what most children in the territory had ever worn. Wait here with Sophie, Jackson instructed Isaiah, dismounting with fluid grace despite his size. The ranch manager nodded, helping Sophie down from the saddle, while Jackson approached the throng of townspeople. Through gaps in the crowd, he glimpsed a well-dressed stranger standing beside Sheriff Haynes on the steps of the office. Tall, lean, with a neatly trimmed beard and the bearing of a professional man, the stranger addressed the gathered citizens with practiced ease. One at a time, folks, Haynes was saying, raising his hands for calm. Mr. Harrison Pierce here is just asking questions, that's all. What kind of questions? Someone shouted from the crowd. About our children? The stranger, Pierce, held up a hand. I assure you I'm simply investigating the attack on the Harrison wagon. Your children are not my concern unless they've witnessed something pertinent. Pierce's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Jackson. Something like recognition flickered in their depths, though Jackson was certain they'd never met. Pierce whispered something to the sheriff, who nodded and gestured Jackson forward. Sheriff, Jackson called, making his way through the parting crowd. A word? Inside the sheriff's office, Haynes made introductions. This is Harrison Pierce, private investigator from Denver. He's looking into the attack you reported. Who hired you? Jackson asked directly, studying the man's expensive but travel-worn suit. Pierce's smile was practiced, revealing nothing. The Harrisons were working for clients of mine. Their deaths are concerning. And what exactly is your interest in this case, Mr. Pierce? Jackson asked, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. My interest is in keeping the child alive, Pierce replied with sudden directness. The people who killed her parents will be looking for her. She's a witness to things powerful men want kept hidden. Things involving Nathaniel Crawford, Jackson ventured. Pierce's eyebrows rose slightly. You're well informed for a man who found her less than 2 days ago. Sophie has begun talking, Jackson explained. She mentioned a cellar where children were held. Mentioned Crawford by name. Pierce cursed softly. Then she's in even more danger than I thought. He paced the small office, boots scuffing against the wooden floor. The Harrisons weren't just anyone, Mr. Blackwood. James Harrison was a federal marshal working undercover. His wife, Alice, was a former Pinkerton agent. They were investigating a child trafficking ring operating across 3 states. They were taking evidence to Judge Maxwell, Jackson said. Pierce looked surprised. You know about that? Found a letter in their belongings. Sophie mentioned they were taking her to a judge who had been friends with her father. Pierce nodded. William Maxwell. He contacted my agency after receiving a letter from Harrison warning him that his son was involved in the trafficking operation. And now the Harrisons are dead, the evidence is missing, and Crawford knows Sophie is with me, Jackson summarized grimly. Not all the evidence, Pierce corrected. The letter you found is part of it, and Sophie herself is a witness. Sheriff Haynes spoke up, his weathered face troubled. You're saying Nathaniel Crawford, one of the most respected men in this county, is involved in kidnapping children? Which is why we need evidence that will stand up in court, Pierce replied. As if summoned by his name, the door opened and Nathaniel Crawford himself stepped in. The banker's presence filled the small office, his tailored suit and gold watch chain speaking of wealth nearly on par with Jackson's own. Sheriff Haynes, Crawford smiled broadly. I heard about our visitor and thought I might introduce myself. His eyes moved to Pierce. Harrison Pierce, is it? I understand you're investigating a tragic attack on travelers. Crawford's handshake was brief, his attention already shifting to Jackson. Blackwood, I trust the child as well? Sophie is fine, Jackson said stiffly. Crawford smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Children are precious, aren't they? So vulnerable. They need protection. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Well, I won't keep you, gentlemen. Sheriff, Mr. Pierce, Blackwood. With that, Crawford departed, leaving an uneasy silence. He knows, Pierce said quietly. He's warning us off. Jackson headed for the door. I need to get back to Sophie. Outside, Isaiah stood alone with the horses. Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Isaiah, Jackson called, fighting to keep his voice steady. Where is Sophie? That school teacher. Mrs. Reed came by, Isaiah explained. Said she had books for Sophie, asked if she could take her to the school while you finished your business. I didn't see any harm in it. Crawford went right past them, Jackson realized, cold dread washing through him. The 3 men set off toward the schoolhouse at a run. The door stood ajar. Jackson pushed it open, calling Sophie's name. The scene inside froze his blood. Sophie stood near the blackboard with Abigail Reed beside her, but it was the third figure that sent Jackson's hand to his revolver. Curtis Blackwood, a known associate of Crawford's, held a gun pointed at Mrs. Reed's head. Blackwood was a brute of a man, his face a map of old scars and malice. Ah, Blackwood, Crawford's henchman drawled. Just in time to say goodbye to little Sophie here. She's coming with me to meet her real family. Sophie's eyes found Jackson's, wide with terror. You promised, she whispered. In that moment, everything crystallized for Jackson. The past 7 years of grief and isolation fell away, replaced by absolute clarity. He had failed Catherine through no fault of his own. He would not fail Sophie. Let them go, Blackwood, Jackson said, his voice steady. Your quarrel is with me. Blackwood laughed. Ain't got no quarrel with you, rich man. Just following orders. The girl comes with me, nice and quiet, and nobody gets hurt. Pierce stepped forward. Federal agent, put down the weapon. What happened next occurred in the span of heartbeats. Isaiah drew a small derringer from his boot. Mrs. Reed drove her elbow into Blackwood's ribs. Sophie dropped to the floor as Blackwood's gun went off, the bullet splintering the blackboard above her head. Jackson drew his silver-chased Colt and fired once. The bullet struck Blackwood in the shoulder. Pierce followed with his own shot, hitting the man's gun hand. Blackwood screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor. Sophie ran to Jackson, and he caught her as she flung herself into his arms. I've got you, he whispered. You're safe. Mrs. Reed was pale but composed. He was waiting when we arrived. Said he was Sophie's uncle, come to collect her. Pierce and Isaiah secured Blackwood, binding his wounds. The man cursed steadily, promising retribution from Crawford. We need to get him to the sheriff, Pierce said, and Sophie somewhere safe. The ranch, Jackson nodded. Crawford won't expect us to go back there now. I'm coming with you, Mrs. Reed announced firmly. Sophie needs a woman's care, and I'd feel safer away from town for now. Sheriff Haynes arrived, drawn by the gunshots. Crawford? He asked simply. Crawford, Pierce confirmed. This one's just a hired gun. The real enemy is still out there. Haynes nodded grimly. I'll lock this one up tight, but I can't hold Crawford without evidence. We'll find the evidence, Jackson promised, his voice hard as iron. As they rode out of town, Jackson with Sophie before him, Mrs. Reed on a borrowed mare, Isaiah leading the way, Jackson felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Sophie leaned back against his chest, her small body warm and trusting, despite the trauma she had just endured. You came for me, she said, wonder in her voice. I promised, didn't I? Jackson replied, and I keep my promises. The journey back to Sundown Ranch passed in tense silence. Jackson kept Sophie close, his arm tight around her small frame as they rode. Every shadow on the trail seemed a potential threat. Every rustle in the bushes, a possible ambush. Behind them, Abigail Reed rode with the straight-back determination of a woman who had faced adversity before. Isaiah led the way, rifle across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Twilight had deepened into darkness by the time the silhouette of the ranch house appeared against the starlit sky. Victoria was waiting on the porch, her weathered face etched with worry. She rushed forward as Jackson dismounted with Sophie in his arms. Gracias a Dios, she breathed, crossing herself. I heard gunshots in town. People are saying... Later, Jackson cut her off with a glance at Sophie's exhausted face. This is Mrs. Reed. She'll be staying with us for a while. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and ushered them inside. The house felt different now. Not the empty mausoleum it had been for years, but a fortress, a sanctuary against the gathering storm. I'll prepare the second guest room, Victoria said, already moving toward the stairs, and something to eat. Thank you, Isaiah added. It's been a long day. Jackson set Sophie down gently in the kitchen. She swayed slightly, fatigue evident in every line of her small body. The events at the schoolhouse had drained what little reserve of strength she had built since he found her. You were very brave today, he told her, kneeling to meet her eyes. Sophie shook her head. I was scared. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Jackson said. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are scared. A faint smile touched her lips, and she leaned forward to rest her forehead against his shoulder. The simple gesture of trust tightened Jackson's throat. Abigail Reed watched the interaction with thoughtful eyes. She had removed her hat, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. In the lamplight, her face showed signs of strain, but her composure remained intact. That man, Blackwood, she said quietly, ensuring Sophie couldn't hear. He knew exactly when I would be taking Sophie to the school. Someone told him. Jackson's jaw tightened. Crawford has eyes and ears all over town. It's more than that, Abigail replied. He mentioned specific details about what I had said to your ranch hand. Details he couldn't have known unless someone close to us is feeding him information, Jackson finished grimly. The thought was unsettling. Jackson had kept to himself for years, his circle of trust limited to Isaiah and Victoria. Now, with Sophie's life at stake, he was forced to expand that circle to include Pierce and Mrs. Reed, both virtual strangers. Victoria returned and led Sophie upstairs to wash before dinner. When they were alone, Abigail's composed facade cracked slightly. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice lower now, I need to tell you something about my husband. Jackson raised an eyebrow, waiting. He didn't just disappear, Abigail continued. He was investigating missing children, specifically children who had vanished from our school and others in the county. He believed someone powerful was involved. She looked up, her green eyes intense. The night before he disappeared, he mentioned a name. Crawford, Jackson said. It wasn't a question. I know it, Abigail replied, but I could never prove it. No one would listen to a grieving widow with suspicions but no evidence. Her hands clenched in her lap. When I saw Sophie today, when Blackwood came for her, it was like seeing the past repeat itself. I couldn't let another child disappear. Jackson studied her. The school teacher had risked her life to protect Sophie, had left the relative safety of town to join them in what was quickly becoming a dangerous crusade against one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Thank you," he said simply. Abigail nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Dinner was a subdued affair, Sophie fighting to stay awake at the table. Afterward, Victoria took her upstairs to bed while the adults gathered in Jackson's study. Isaiah had brought out a bottle of whiskey, and even Abigail accepted a small glass. "Pierce called himself a federal agent," Jackson said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But something doesn't fit." Isaiah nodded. "Most federal agents I've known don't operate alone, especially not on a case this big." "Perhaps he's undercover," Abigail suggested. "Or perhaps he's not what he claims to be," Jackson countered. "We only have his word that the Harrisons were federal agents." "You don't trust him," Isaiah observed. Jackson took a sip of his whiskey. "I don't trust anyone I met after yesterday." He glanced at Abigail. "Present company partially accepted." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Wise of you, Mr. Blackwood." "So what now?" Isaiah asked. "Crawford knows Sophie is with us. He knows she can identify him. He won't stop coming for her." "We need evidence," Jackson said firmly. "Something that will stand up in court. Something that will convince even Crawford's friends in high places. Sophie's testimony alone won't be enough against a man of his standing." "The letter mentioned financial records," Abigail pointed out. "If we could find those, they'd be at the bank," Isaiah said. "Crawford practically lives in that place." Jackson stood and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. "We need to know more about this operation. Sophie mentioned a cellar where children were kept. If we could find it, free any children still there." "The abandoned mine," Isaiah reminded him. "It's worth checking." "Tomorrow," Jackson decided. "I'll ride out at dawn." "I should go with you," Isaiah argued. "That's precisely why you need to stay." Jackson cut him off. "If something happens to me, Sophie will need protection." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. Victoria stood there, her expression troubled. "The child is asking for you, Mr. Blackwood." "Another nightmare, I think." Jackson excused himself and headed upstairs. In the guest room, Sophie sat huddled against the headboard, her knees drawn up to her chest, her corn-husk doll clutched tightly. "They're coming for me," she whispered as Jackson entered. "In my dream, they found me again." Jackson sat on the edge of the bed. "It was just a dream, Sophie." "But it wasn't," she insisted, her blue eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Crawford knows where I am. He'll send more men like Mr. Blackwood." Jackson couldn't deny her fear, couldn't offer platitudes when the danger was all too real. Instead, he reached out and took her small hand in his. "Listen to me, Sophie," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I made you a promise and I intend to keep it. No one is going to take you away from here. Not Crawford, not anyone." "How can you be sure?" she asked. Jackson thought of Catherine, of how powerless he had been to save his daughter from fever. This was different. This was an enemy he could fight, a danger he could stand against. "Because this time I can do something about it," he said, as much to himself as to Sophie. "I have the resources, the power to protect you." She seemed to consider this, her small face solemn in the lamplight. "My papa used to say that good always wins in the end," she said finally. "Do you think that's true?" The question pierced Jackson like a physical blow. After the war, after losing Catherine, after Eleanor left, he had stopped believing in such simple truths. The world was not divided neatly into good and evil. And even if it were, good did not always triumph. Yet looking at Sophie now, her faith still intact despite everything she had endured, he couldn't bring himself to crush that belief. "I think," he said carefully, "that good stands a better chance when good people stand together, and when they have the means to fight." This seemed to satisfy her. She scooted down beneath the covers, still holding his hand. "Will you tell me another story? Like the one about the stars?" Jackson smiled faintly. "I think I can manage that." He began a tale about a lone wolf who found a lost cub in the forest and took it home, only to discover that protecting the cub gave him a strength and purpose he had forgotten he possessed. As he spoke, Sophie's eyes grew heavy, and soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Jackson gently withdrew his hand and stood. At the door, he paused and looked back at the small figure in the bed. For 7 years, he had lived with ghosts. Now life, fragile, precious, demanding life, had returned to his house. With it came danger, but also something he had thought lost forever: hope. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Wyoming hills. Jackson saddled his horse in the gray light, the breath of both man and beast forming clouds in the chill air. Isaiah stood nearby, his dark face etched with concern. "The abandoned mine is about 2 hours' ride southwest, near the river bend," he said. "If Crawford has men there—" "I'm just scouting," Jackson assured him, checking his revolver before sliding it into his holster. "I'll keep my distance, see what I can learn without being seen." Isaiah nodded, unconvinced. "And if you find children there?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "Then I'll come back with help, Pierce the sheriff, someone with authority." "Be careful who you trust," Isaiah warned. "Crawford's influence runs deep." A sound from the porch drew their attention. Sophie stood there in her nightgown, Victoria's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched silently as Jackson mounted his horse. "I'll be back before sunset," he called to her. Sophie nodded once, her face solemn. No tears, no pleas for him to stay. Just quiet acceptance that held a maturity beyond her years. Jackson tipped his hat to her, then urged his horse forward, away from the ranch and toward the distant hills. The morning was silent, save for the steady rhythm of hooves against earth and the occasional call of a hog overhead. Jackson rode with purpose, his mind churning over the events of the past 2 days. His life had been upended since finding Sophie, thrust suddenly into a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the borders of his ranch. And yet, there was a strange clarity to it all. For 7 years, he had existed in a fog of grief, moving through his days with no purpose beyond survival. Now, with Sophie depending on him, that fog had lifted. The path forward was dangerous, perhaps deadly, but at least there was a path. The abandoned mine came into view as the sun climbed higher. From a distance, it appeared deserted, the entrance partially collapsed, its timber supports weathered gray. But as Jackson tethered his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and approached on foot, he noticed signs of recent activity: wagon tracks in the mud, a path worn through the tall grass. He crouched behind a boulder, observing. The mine entrance was blocked by a heavy wooden door that looked newer than the surrounding timbers. A padlock secured it. Off to one side stood a small cabin, smoke rising thinly from its chimney. Someone was here. Jackson watched for nearly an hour, his patience rewarded when the cabin door opened. A man emerged, heavy-set, bearded, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He walked to the mine entrance, unlocked the padlock, and disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, he emerged with 2 children, a boy and a girl, no older than Sophie. Their clothes were dirty, their faces gaunt. The man herded them toward the cabin, his manner gruff but not overtly cruel. Jackson's blood ran cold. Sophie had spoken the truth. Here was evidence of Crawford's trafficking operation, hidden away in an abandoned mine. How many more children were inside? Where were they being taken? And how many others had already been sold to mines or worse? He needed to get back to the ranch, to Pierce and the sheriff. With witnesses and evidence, they could bring Crawford to justice. Jackson began to retreat, careful to stay hidden. He had almost reached his horse when a voice behind him froze him in place. "That's far enough, mister." Slowly, Jackson turned. A second man stood 15 feet away, rifle aimed squarely at Jackson's chest. This one was younger, leaner than the first, with cold eyes and a week's growth of beard. "Just passing through," Jackson said, keeping his voice casual. "Looking for strays from my herd." "With no horse nearby?" The man gestured with his rifle. "Hands up where I can see them." Jackson complied, his mind racing. The man was too far away to rush, and any movement toward his holstered revolver would likely earn him a bullet. "Walk," the man ordered, indicating the direction of the cabin. "And don't try anything stupid." "Jenkins," he called out, "we got company." The heavy-set man, Jenkins, appeared at the cabin door, his own rifle raised. His eyes widened slightly as Jackson was marched into the clearing. "Well, look at that," Jenkins said. "If it ain't the great Jackson Blackwood himself. Boss said you might come sniffing around." Crawford sent you to watch for me specifically? Jackson asked, a cold weight settling in his stomach. Had they been betrayed? Jenkins chuckled. Boss knows a lot of things. Knows you found something that belongs to him, for instance. He jerked his head toward the cabin. Inside, we're going to have a nice chat while we wait for Mr. Crawford to arrive. The interior of the cabin was sparse. A table, a few chairs, a stove in the corner. The two children Jackson had seen earlier huddled in the far corner, their eyes vacant with fear or resignation. Three more children sat on the floor nearby, equally subdued. None spoke or cried out. Sit, Jenkins ordered, indicating a chair. Jackson remained standing, his eyes on the children. How many more are in the mine? The younger man slammed the butt of his rifle into Jackson's back, driving him to his knees. He said, sit. Jackson got to his feet slowly, his eyes never leaving Jenkins. Crawford won't get away with this. People know what he's doing. Federal agents are involved now. Jenkins snorted. You mean Pierce? That Fed's been sniffing around for months. Hasn't found a thing, and he won't. He leaned in close, his breath foul. You know why? Because people in high places want this operation to continue. Mines need small hands to reach tight places. Fancy houses back east need maids and servants who won't run off. There's good money in children, Dr. Blackwood. Jackson's stomach turned at the casual depravity. And Judge Maxwell, was he one of your people in high places? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Jenkins's face. The old man? Nah, he was a problem. Started developing a conscience in his old age. A cruel smile twisted his lips. But problems have a way of solving themselves. You killed him, Jackson said flatly. Not me personally, Jenkins replied with a shrug. But yeah, the judge had an unfortunate accident about a month back. Horse threw him into a ravine, very sad. The pieces were falling into place. Judge Maxwell had reached out to the Harrisons after receiving evidence of Crawford's crimes. Crawford had his father killed, then set a trap for the Harrisons. Now Sophie, the last living witness who could connect Crawford to the trafficking operation, was in his sights. Crawford won't be here for hours, Jackson said, thinking rapidly. You really plan to just sit and wait? That's exactly the plan, the younger man said, taking up position by the window. Boss was very specific. Hold you here, don't damage you too badly. Wait for him. And these children, Jackson pressed, what happens to them? Jenkins's face darkened. None of your concern, Blackwood. They're merchandise, nothing more. Jackson glanced at the children again. 5 pairs of eyes watched him with a mixture of curiosity and dread. They had been broken somehow, their spirits crushed by captivity and fear. All except one, the smallest boy, perhaps 5 years old, who met Jackson's gaze with a flicker of defiance still alive in his eyes. I need water, Jackson said, his mouth suddenly dry. Been riding all morning. Jenkins nodded to the younger man. Give him a drink, Tate. Can't have him dying of thirst before the boss gets here. Tate moved to a bucket in the corner, dipped a ladle, and brought it to Jackson. As he leaned down to offer the water, Jackson surged upward, driving his shoulder into Tate's midsection and sending them both crashing into the table. The ladle clattered to the floor, water spraying across the boards. Jenkins reached for his rifle, but Jackson was already rolling, pulling Tate's body between them as a shield. The younger man struggled, clawing at Jackson's arms, but Jackson had the advantage of surprise and desperation. Stay back, Jackson warned, his arm around Tate's throat, or your friend here gets hurt. Jenkins hesitated, his rifle half raised. You're making a mistake, Blackwood. Even if you get past me, where are you going to go? The mine's 2 hours from anywhere, and you got 5 kids to deal with. We'll manage, Jackson replied, tightening his grip on Tate, who was beginning to turn red from lack of air. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. The small boy with the defiant eyes suddenly darted forward, grabbed the fallen ladle, and swung it with all his might at Jenkins's knee. The man howled in pain, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as he stumbled. In that moment of chaos, Jackson released Tate, who fell gasping to the floor, and lunged for Jenkins. The struggle was brief but brutal. Jenkins was heavier, stronger, but Jackson fought with the desperation of a man who had found something worth fighting for. He managed to wrest the rifle away, and bring it down hard on Jenkins's head. The man collapsed, unconscious. Tate was struggling to his feet, reaching for a knife at his belt. Jackson swung the rifle around, its barrel leveled at the younger man's chest. "Don't," Jackson said quietly. Something in his voice, perhaps the deadly certainty that he would pull the trigger, made Tate freeze. Slowly he raised his hands. "The keys to the mine," Jackson demanded. "Where are they?" "Jenkins has them," Tate replied, his eyes darting to his fallen companion. "In his pocket." Jackson kept the rifle trained on Tate while he searched Jenkins's coat, finding a ring of keys. To the children, who were watching wide-eyed, he said, "It's all right, I'm here to help. We're going to get you all home." The smallest boy, who had struck Jenkins with the ladle, stepped forward. "Are you really?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. "Really?" "Really," Jackson assured him. "But first, we need to see if there are more children in the mine." Securing Tate with his own belt and Jenkins with a length of rope found in the cabin, Jackson led the children outside. The mine entrance was locked, as he had seen earlier, but the keys from Jenkins's pocket included one that fit the padlock. The heavy door swung open to reveal a dark tunnel braced with timber supports. The smell that wafted out was damp and musty, tinged with something worse: unwashed bodies, waste, and fear. "Stay close," Jackson told the children, taking a lantern from the cabin. "Call out if you see anyone else." The mine tunnel extended about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Here the horror of Crawford's operation became fully apparent. The chamber had been converted into a makeshift prison. Pallets lined the walls, each with a thin blanket. Iron rings had been driven into the rock, chains attached to some. In one corner stood a bucket of stagnant water. In another, a pail serving as a latrine. And huddled against the far wall were 7 more children, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 12. They blinked in the sudden light, some raising their hands to shield their eyes, others too weak to move. "It's all right," Jackson called softly, setting down the lantern. "I'm here to help. You're free now." One of the older children, a girl with matted blonde hair, struggled to her feet. "Mister," she croaked, her voice barely audible, "are you real, or are we dreaming again?" The question broke something in Jackson's chest. How long had these children been held here, dreaming of rescue that never came? "I'm real," he assured her, moving forward to examine the chains. Some of the children were shackled to the wall, though most were simply locked in the chamber. The keys from Jenkins worked on these locks as well. As Jackson freed the last child, a boy of about 8 with a festering sore on his ankle, he made a silent vow. Crawford would pay for this, not just through the law, but in any way Jackson could make him suffer. The boy with the ankle injury couldn't walk. Jackson lifted him gently, surprised at how little the child weighed. Malnutrition, his medical mind supplied. Prolonged captivity in darkness. The boy would need careful treatment to recover fully. "Can you lead the others out?" Jackson asked the small boy who had helped him in the cabin, the one with defiance still burning in his eyes. "My name is Daniel," the boy said. "And yes, sir, I can help." Jackson nodded, impressed by the child's composure. "Good man, Daniel. Get everyone outside. We need to move quickly." Leading the children from the mine into the sunlight was like witnessing a resurrection. Some wept at the brightness, others stood in stunned silence, blinking as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. All were malnourished, dirty, and bearing various signs of mistreatment: bruises, sores, the vacant stare of trauma. Jackson counted 12 children in total, including the 5 from the cabin. 12 young lives that had been reduced to commodities, 12 families devastated. He felt fury building within him, cold and implacable. "We need to get them to safety," Jackson said, more to himself than to the children. But how? His horse couldn't carry them all, and the nearest town was hours away, even with healthy riders. The decision was made for him when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, riders approaching, at least 3, maybe more. "Crawford," Jackson muttered, "coming to deal with him personally." He hustled the children back into the cabin, his mind racing. Jenkins and Tate were still secure, but with 12 children to protect and only himself as defense, their position was untenable. "Listen to me," he told the children, keeping his voice calm despite the mounting tension. "Some bad men are coming. We need to hide." Daniel tugged at his sleeve. "There's a cave behind the waterfall," he said. We found it once when they let us wash. Good thinking, Jackson praised. Show us quickly. The boy led them out the back of the cabin, down a slight incline to where a small stream bubbled over rocks. They followed it for perhaps 100 yards to where it tumbled over a 10-foot drop, forming a modest waterfall. Behind it, just as Daniel had said, was a shallow cave. Everyone inside, Jackson directed, helping the weaker children navigate the slippery rocks. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear. When all 12 were hidden, Jackson turned back toward the cabin. The riders were visible now, 4 men on horseback, led by a figure in an immaculate suit. Nathaniel Crawford had arrived, just as Jackson had expected. Jackson concealed himself behind a boulder, watching as Crawford and his men dismounted at the cabin. They disappeared inside, emerging moments later with expressions of fury. Crawford barked orders, and the men began to search the area. They would find the track soon enough. The children had left a clear trail to the stream. Moving silently through the underbrush, Jackson circled back until he was behind the searchers. Crawford stood by his horse, smoking a cigar and directing his men with imperious gestures. He seemed unconcerned, confident in his power and the isolation of the mine. Jackson's hand moved to his silver-chased Colt. One shot, that was all it would take to end this, to ensure Sophie's safety, to avenge the children whose lives Crawford had destroyed. It would be so easy, but it wouldn't be justice. And without Crawford's testimony, they might never uncover the full extent of the trafficking operation. Jackson drew his revolver and stepped out of cover. That's far enough, Crawford. The banker turned slowly, his handsome face registering first surprise, then a calculating assessment. Blackwood, he said, his voice smooth as silk. This is a misunderstanding. I've come because of reports of children gone missing. Save it, Jackson replied. I've seen your operation. I've freed the children you were keeping like animals. Crawford's expression hardened. You're interfering in matters beyond your understanding, Blackwood. There's a natural order to things. Some children are destined for greater purpose than grubbing in the dirt of a family farm. We provide opportunity. You provide slavery, Jackson countered, his grip tightening on his revolver. And it ends today. Crawford sighed, as if disappointed by Jackson's failure to grasp his vision. You think you can stop this? Me? I own half the county, Blackwood. The other half owes me money. Who do you think people will believe? A respected businessman or a recluse who spent 7 years drowning his sorrows in whiskey? They'll believe evidence, Jackson said. And witnesses. The children. Sophie, Pierce. Pierce, Crawford spat the name. That federal parasite has been sniffing around for months without finding anything concrete. As for Sophie and these other children, well, he smiled coldly. Children have such vivid imaginations, and sometimes tragic accidents befall them. One of Crawford's men had been inching toward Jackson during this exchange. Now he lunged, drawing his gun. Jackson fired first, the bullet catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. The other men reached for their weapons, but Crawford raised a hand. Hold, he commanded. Blackwood is a reasonable man. We can resolve this without further bloodshed. He turned his snake-like smile on Jackson. What is it you want, Blackwood? Money? Land? Name your price. Jackson felt a cold fury build within him. There's only one thing I want from you, Crawford. Justice, Wyfarman. Crawford's smile faded. Then I'm afraid we have nothing more to discuss. He nodded to his men. Kill him. Find the children. Leave no witnesses. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Jackson dove for cover as bullets splintered the rock beside him. He returned fire methodically, each shot from his expensive revolver finding its mark. One man fell, then another. The third rushed him, knife drawn. Jackson's revolver clicked on an empty chamber. He threw the weapon aside and met the attacker with bare hands. They grappled, falling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. The man was younger, stronger, but Jackson fought with the cold determination of one who had already lost everything once and would not lose again. As they struggled, Jackson became aware that Crawford was escaping, mounting his horse and spurring it away from the mine. He couldn't pursue, not while locked in combat, not with the children still hiding and vulnerable. With a surge of desperate strength, Jackson broke his opponent's grip and drove his elbow into the man's temple. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and the man went limp. Jackson staggered to his feet, breathing hard. Crawford was gone, riding hard back toward redemption. 3 of his men lay wounded or unconscious, but Jackson knew the banker would return with more. They needed to leave now. He gathered the children from their hiding place and led them back to the cabin. Jenkins and Tate were still secured, cursing and threatening as Jackson loaded the cabin's meager supplies onto Jenkins' wagon. "You've signed your death warrant, Blackwood," Jenkins spat. "Crawford will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let him try," Jackson replied, helping the last child onto the wagon. He had found a second rifle and ammunition in the cabin, which he kept close at hand. With Daniel beside him on the driver's seat, Jackson snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, bearing its cargo of rescued children away from the nightmare of the mine and toward an uncertain future. The journey back to Sundown Ranch was slow and tense. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rough terrain, its passengers huddled beneath blankets against the chill wind. Jackson kept constant watch, expecting Crawford's men to materialize from every shadow. The small boy who had helped him, Daniel, sat beside Jackson, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "Did you really come looking for us?" Daniel asked as the sun began to set. "Or did you just find us by accident?" "A bit of both," Jackson admitted. "I was looking, but I didn't know for sure what I would find." Daniel nodded, digesting this. "The other men came sometimes, took children away. They never came back." He looked up at Jackson, his eyes old in his young face. "Are we really going home?" Jackson hesitated. The truth was, he had no idea where home was for most of these children. Some had been taken from distant towns, others purchased from desperate families, or simply stolen from the streets. Finding their rightful places would be a monumental task. "First, we're going to my ranch," he said finally. "You'll be safe there while we figure out where everyone belongs." This seemed to satisfy Daniel, who fell silent, watching the trail ahead with the vigilance of a child who had learned the hard way that danger could come from anywhere. Night had fallen by the time they reached Sundown Ranch. The house blazed with lamplight, unusual for the normally quiet homestead. As they approached, the front door burst open and several figures spilled onto the porch. Isaiah reached the wagon first, his expression transforming from concern to shock as he saw its cargo of children. "Jackson, what in God's name?" "They were at the mine," Jackson said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "Crawford's operation. There are 12 of them." Abigail Reed appeared behind Isaiah, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. "The poor dears," she breathed, then, recovering her composure. "Victoria's heating water. We'll need baths, food, clean clothes." She was already moving, the teacher in her taking charge of the situation with brisk efficiency. Victoria joined her, and together they began helping children down from the wagon, speaking softly, assessing needs with experienced eyes. Sophie stood in the doorway, her small figure silhouetted against the light from within. When she saw Jackson, she ran down the steps and across the yard, stopping just short of him as if suddenly uncertain. "You came back," she said, her voice small. Jackson knelt before her, his body aching from the day's exertions. "I promised I would." Sophie looked past him to the wagon, to the children being led toward the house. Recognition dawned in her eyes. "You found them," she whispered. "The others from the cellar." Jackson nodded. "Some of them. Because of you, Sophie. Because you were brave enough to tell us what happened." Without warning, Sophie flung her arms around his neck, her body trembling against his. Jackson held her close, feeling something heal within him at the simple contact. Over Sophie's shoulder, he met Isaiah's concerned gaze. "Crawford knows," Jackson said quietly. "He came to the mine. I had to leave 3 of his men there, but he escaped. He'll be back with more men." Isaiah nodded grimly. "Pierce returned while you were gone. Claims he was gathering evidence in town. He's inside." Jackson's suspicion of the supposed federal agent had not diminished. "Keep an eye on him," he murmured, "and postcards tonight. Crawford won't wait long to retaliate." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The rescued children were bathed, fed, clothed in whatever could be found that might fit them. Mattresses were dragged from storage and arranged in the main parlor, creating a makeshift dormitory. Victoria and Abigail worked tirelessly, tending to physical needs while offering the gentle reassurance that only women seemed able to provide. Sophie appointed herself assistant, fetching blankets and helping the younger children settle. Watching her, Jackson felt a surge of pride. The traumatized child he had found beneath a wagon was emerging as a caretaker in her own right, her natural compassion shining through the layers of fear and hurt. It was past midnight when Jackson finally met with Isaiah, Abigail, and Pierce in his study. The so-called federal agent paced before the fireplace, his expression troubled. 12 children, he said, shaking his head. God almighty, and you say Crawford himself was there? Jackson nodded, accepting the glass of whiskey Isaiah handed him. Saw him with my own eyes, heard him give the order to kill me and the children. There's no ambiguity here, Pierce. Crawford is directly involved in trafficking children. Pierce ran a hand through his beard. This complicates things. I was hoping to build a case slowly, gather evidence without tipping our hand. Now Crawford knows we're on to him. Our hand was tipped the moment Sophie escaped, Abigail pointed out. Crawford has been one step ahead of us from the beginning. Jackson studied Pierce over the rim of his glass. You still haven't explained your exact role in all this. Who do you work for? Where's your badge? Your credentials? Pierce hesitated, exchanging a glance with Isaiah. I think it's time for complete honesty, Mr. Blackwood. He reached into his coat and withdrew not a badge, but a folded document. I am a federal agent, but not in the way you might imagine. I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, contracted by the Department of Justice to investigate a suspected trafficking ring operating across several territories. Jackson took the document, a letter of commission from the Pinkerton Agency authorizing one Harrison Pierce to investigate criminal activities in Wyoming territory. It appeared genuine, though Jackson was hardly an expert on such matters. The Harrisons? He asked, returning the letter. James Harrison was my partner, Pierce replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Alice was his wife, yes, but also one of the few female Pinkerton agents. They were working undercover, posing as a family traveling west. Pierce hesitated, glancing toward the door as if ensuring no one could overhear. Sophie was their entry into the trafficking ring, a child they claimed to have found abandoned, which they used to make contact with Crawford's organization. Wait, Jackson interrupted, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Are you saying Sophie isn't their daughter? Pierce looked uncomfortable. No, she's not. The real Sophie Harrison died of fever 2 years ago. When James and Alice discovered the Crawfords' operation, they needed a way in. He hesitated. They purchased a child from another trafficking ring we had infiltrated. That child is who you know as Sophie. The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. Sophie, the girl he had grown to care for, had promised to protect, was herself a victim twice over, used as a pawn in a dangerous game by the very people she had come to see as parents. Does she know? He asked, his voice hardly more than a whisper. I doubt it, Pierce replied. The Harrisons were good people, Blackwood. They treated her well, planned to adopt her officially once the case was closed. They died trying to bring her to safety, trying to expose Crawford's operation. Jackson drained his whiskey in one swallow, the burn doing nothing to ease the knot in his chest. So, who is she? What's her real name? Where did she come from? Pierce spread his hands helplessly. We don't know. The traffickers who sold her to the Harrisons had no records, no names. She was just merchandise. He spat the word like it tasted foul. The Harrisons called her Sophie because they had to call her something, and I suppose it helped them remember why they were doing what they did. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice gentle but firm. None of this changes our current situation. Crawford is coming for the children. All of them, but especially Sophie. We need to prepare. Isaiah nodded. The ranch can be defended, but not indefinitely. Not against the kind of force Crawford can bring to bear. We need the law on our side. With 12 rescued children and Sophie's testimony, we have enough to convince the territorial authorities, if not the local sheriff, Pierce said. The nearest territorial office is in Cheyenne, Isaiah pointed out. 3 days' ride at least. And that's with healthy adults on good horses, with a wagon full of children. We don't have to go to them, Jackson said, his mind working rapidly despite his exhaustion. Judge Hollister is due in redemption tomorrow for the monthly circuit court. He answers to territorial authority, not local interests. If we can get the children to him, get Sophie's testimony on record. Crawford will have men watching the roads, Pierce warned. In the town, he won't let us near the judge. Then we don't use the roads, Jackson decided. We cut across country, approach Redemption from the north where the hills provide cover. We can get within a mile of town before being exposed. Even if we reach Judge Hollister, will he act against someone as powerful as Crawford? Abigail asked. Men like that protect each other. Hollister is different, Isaiah said. He was a Union officer during the war, fought against slavery. If anyone will listen to charges of child trafficking, it's him. Jackson stood, his decision made. We leave at first light, pack only what's essential: food, water, medicine. The wagon will slow us down, but we can't ask these children to ride after what they've been through. As the others filed out to make preparations, Jackson remained in his study, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The revelation about Sophie's true origins gnawed at him. Did it change how he felt about her? Did it matter that she wasn't who he thought she was? No, he realized. It didn't matter at all. Sophie was Sophie, a child who had suffered, who had shown courage beyond her years, who had somehow begun to heal the wound in his heart that Catherine's death had left. Whatever her origins, whoever she had been before, she was his responsibility now. His to protect, his to care for. And nothing, not Crawford, not his men, not the ghosts of the past, would change that. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the house. Inside, 12 rescued children slept the sleep of the truly exhausted. Safe for the first time in months. Among them, Sophie dreamed, perhaps of a future where shadows no longer lurked in every corner. And in his study, Jackson Blackwood prepared for war. Dawn was barely a suggestion on the eastern horizon when the ranch stirred to life. Jackson moved efficiently, directing the loading of supplies while Isaiah checked the wagon's wheels and axles. They couldn't afford a breakdown once they were on the move. The children were bundled into the wagon, wrapped in blankets against the pre-dawn chill. Their faces were solemn, eyes wide with uncertainty. After their ordeal at the mine, they had learned to fear change, to distrust promises of safety. Victoria had worked through the night preparing food for the journey and packs of medical supplies. Now she moved among the children, offering reassurance in soft Spanish and English. Pierce paced near the barn, his face taut with tension. The supposed Pinkerton agent had insisted on accompanying them to Redemption, claiming his testimony would lend authority to their case. Jackson remained wary. Pierce's revelation about Sophie's origins still rankled, raising questions about how much else the man might be hiding. We're almost ready, Abigail Reed reported, approaching Jackson where he stood by the porch. In the dim light, her face looked drawn with fatigue, but her eyes were clear and determined. The children have been fed. Those who needed medical attention have been tended to. Jackson nodded, his gaze drifting to Sophie, who sat on the porch steps, her corn-husk doll clutched in her hands. Since finding the other children, Sophie had been quieter, more withdrawn. Jackson wondered what memories their presence had stirred, what horrors she was reliving. He crossed to her, sitting beside her on the weathered steps. You should be in the wagon, he said gently. It's still cold out here. Sophie didn't look up. Are they going to take me away from you? The question caught Jackson off guard. What makes you think that? I heard Mr. Pierce talking, she said, her voice small but steady. He said I'm not really Sophie, that my mama and papa weren't really mine. Jackson's jaw tightened. Pierce must have been discussing the case within Sophie's hearing, careless of the damage his words might do. Another reason to distrust the man. Listen to me, Sophie, Jackson said, turning to face her fully. It doesn't matter what name you were born with or who your first parents were. You are Sophie to me, and I made you a promise, remember? I won't let anyone take you somewhere you're not safe. But if I'm not really Sophie Harrison, then who am I? She asked, finally looking up at him, her blue eyes troubled in the faint light. Jackson felt something crack inside him, the last barrier around his heart giving way. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as he had once held Catherine. You're Sophie, he said firmly, and if you want, you can be Sophie Blackwood too. She stilled in his embrace. Like your daughter? Like yourself, Jackson corrected gently. Your own person, but under my protection. In my care, if that's what you want. Sophie pulled back slightly, studying his face with a seriousness that belied her years. Forever? Not just until this is over? Forever, Jackson promised, no matter what happens today. A small smile bloomed on her face, the first real smile he had seen since the confrontation at the schoolhouse. I'd like that, she whispered. The moment was broken by Isaiah's approach. It's time, he said quietly. We need to move while we still have darkness for cover. Jackson nodded and stood, lifting Sophie in his arms. Let's go then. The wagon pulled away from Sundown Ranch as the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. Isaiah drove, with Jackson riding alongside on horseback. Pierce and Abigail sat at the back of the wagon, rifles across their laps. The 13 children, Sophie and the 12 rescued from the mine, huddled under blankets in the wagon bed, quiet except for an occasional whisper or muffled cough. Jackson had decided that Victoria would remain at the ranch. If they failed, if Crawford's men caught them, someone needed to survive to tell the truth. She had protested, of course, but eventually yielded to the logic of his argument. As they departed, she stood on the porch, a solitary figure in the pre-dawn gloom, making the sign of the cross as they passed from sight. Instead of taking the main road, Isaiah guided the wagon across open country, following game trails and dry creek beds where possible. The going was slow, the wagon jolting over uneven ground. More than once they had to stop to clear rocks or brush from their path. But the alternative, the exposure of the main road, was too dangerous to risk. As the sun climbed higher, bringing warmth to the autumn day, the children began to stir. Some stared in wonder at the open sky above them, at the hawks soaring on thermals, at the distant mountains blue with haze. For those who had been held captive longest, this journey across the Wyoming wilderness was their first taste of freedom in months. Daniel, the small boy who had helped Jackson at the mine, seemed to appoint himself leader of the rescued children. He moved among them, offering encouragement, helping distribute the water and dried meat Victoria had packed. His resilience continued to amaze Jackson. Around midday, they paused in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and allow the children a brief respite from the confines of the wagon. As they ate a simple meal, Jackson noticed Sophie sitting apart from the others, watching them with a mixture of sympathy and unease. You don't need to be afraid of them, he said, crouching beside her. Sophie shook her head. It's not that. I remember some of them from before. I was there longer than they were. The admission sent a chill through Jackson. How long had Sophie been held in that hellish place before the Harrisons had purchased her? What had she endured that she still couldn't speak of? You don't have to talk about it, he assured her. Not until you're ready. Sophie's small hand found his, her fingers cool against his palm. I want to tell the judge everything. So Mr. Crawford can't hurt any more children. Jackson squeezed her hand gently. You're very brave, Sophie. Braver than most adults I know. A faint smile touched her lips. You're brave too. You came for me at the school, and you saved the others by yourself. Before Jackson could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Isaiah, who had been scouting ahead, was signaling from a nearby rise. One long note followed by two short. Danger approaching. Jackson was on his feet instantly. Everyone back to the wagon, he ordered, keeping his voice calm but firm. Quickly now. Pierce and Abigail helped herd the children while Jackson ran to join Isaiah. From the ridge, he could see what had triggered the warning. Riders, at least 6 of them, moving across the plain below. They were still some distance away, but their directions suggested they were cutting across to intercept the main road to redemption. Crawford's men? Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. Isaiah nodded grimly. Looks like they're sweeping the area between the ranch and town. They must have found the mine. Realize we took the children. How far to redemption? Jackson asked, calculating distances in his head. 4, maybe 5 hours at our current pace, Isaiah replied. Less if we could use the main road, but we'd be exposed, Jackson finished, and those riders would spot us immediately. He studied the terrain, looking for options. To the north lay rougher country, hills and draws that would provide cover but slow their progress even further. To the east, the direction of redemption, the land gradually flattened, offering less concealment the closer they got to town. We pushed north, he decided. Stay in the broken ground as long as possible. then make a run for it when we're within sight of town. Isaiah didn't look convinced. The wagon won't handle that terrain well. And the children, they've endured worse, Jackson said grimly. We have no choice. Crawford's men will have the main road watched. They returned to the wagon and quickly explained the situation to Pierce and Abigail. The school teacher's face paled slightly, but she nodded, her jaw set with determination. The children will be frightened, she said, but they'll cooperate. They understand danger. Pierce checked his rifle, his expression grim. If Crawford's men find us out here, away from witnesses, they won't hesitate to kill everyone and bury the bodies where they'll never be found. That's not going to happen, Jackson said firmly. He turned to Sophie, who stood nearby, listening. Remember what I promised? He asked her. She nodded solemnly. That you wouldn't let anyone take me somewhere I wasn't safe. That's right, Jackson agreed, and that goes for all of you now. He raised his voice slightly so all the children could hear. We're going to reach town and find the judge. You'll all be safe then, but the journey might get rough. I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that? 12 solemn faces looked back at him. Then Daniel, the small boy from the mine, stepped forward. We can be brave, he said simply. We've been brave for a long time. The simple dignity of the statement tightened Jackson's throat. These children who had suffered so much were not just victims. They were survivors, each one carrying a strength that adults could only marvel at. Then let's go, he said. The wagon lurched forward again, now veering northward into increasingly rugged terrain. The hills rose around them, scattered with pine and juniper, offering concealment, but making the going painfully slow. Isaiah handled the team with expert precision, guiding them through gullies and over rocky ridges that would have defeated a less skilled driver. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its downward arc when disaster struck. The wagon was crossing a dry wash when a crack like a gunshot split the air. One of the rear wheels had hit a boulder, splitting the wooden rim. Whoa, Isaiah called, hauling on the reins. The wagon lurched to a stop, listing heavily to the damaged side. Jackson was off his horse in an instant, examining the wheel. The damage was severe. Several spokes had shattered along with the rim, not something that could be quickly repaired, even with the tools they carried. How bad? Pierce asked, joining him. Bad enough, Jackson replied grimly. We can't continue with the wagon. The children can't walk all the way to redemption, Abigail protested. Some of them are too weak, and it's still hours away. Jackson stood, dusting his hands on his trousers as he considered their options. They were effectively stranded in rough country with Crawford's men searching for them, and nightfall coming that the children, already weakened by their ordeal, might not survive without proper shelter. We make camp here, he decided. Isaiah and I will ride to redemption, bring back the judge and enough men to escort everyone safely to town. Splitting up is dangerous, Pierce objected. What if Crawford's men find the camp while you're gone? That's why you and Mrs. Reed will stay here, Jackson replied. Find a defensible position. If trouble comes, hold them off until we return with help. It wasn't an ideal plan, but with the wagon disabled, their options were limited. They quickly set about creating a camp in a small hollow surrounded by boulders and pine trees. The natural formation offered some protection from the wind and concealment from distant observers. As Isaiah prepared the horses for the ride to redemption, Jackson knelt beside Sophie. I have to go for help, he explained, but I'll be back before dark. Fear flashed in her eyes, but she mastered it quickly. With the judge? With the judge, Jackson confirmed. You'll stay here with Mrs. Reed and the others. Mr. Pierce will protect you. Sophie glanced at Pierce, her expression dubious. I don't trust him, she whispered. He talks about me like I'm not a real person. Jackson couldn't disagree with her assessment. Pierce's revelation about Sophie's origins had revealed a coldness, a pragmatism that put the case above the child's well-being. But he was armed and capable, and they needed every defender they could get. Trust Mrs. Reed then, Jackson suggested. And remember, I'll be back as soon as I can. Sophie threw her arms around his neck, hugging him fiercely. Be careful, she murmured against his collar. I will, he promised, holding her close for a moment before gently disentangling himself. Be brave. With a final look at the camp, the children huddled together for warmth Abigail organizing them into some semblance of comfort, Pierce standing guard with rifle in hand. Jackson mounted his horse and joined Isaiah. The two men rode out at a gallop, pushing their mounts as fast as the rough terrain would allow. "If we cut directly east, we can reach the main road in about an hour," Isaiah said as they rode. "Then it's a straight run to redemption." Jackson nodded, his mind still on the vulnerable camp they had left behind. "Let's just hope the judge is willing to act against Crawford. He's powerful, Isaiah. Respected. Our word against his won't be enough." "We have the children," Isaiah reminded him. "Their testimony, the brand on Sophie's shoulder, the conditions at the mine. That's evidence no decent man can ignore." They rode in silence after that, each lost in his own thoughts. The landscape gradually changed as they moved eastward, the hills giving way to more open country. Finally, they crested a rise and saw the main road below, a pale ribbon cutting through the prairie toward the distant smudge of buildings that was Redemption. "No riders visible," Isaiah observed, scanning the road in both directions. "Might be our luck is changing." "Let's hope," Jackson replied, though experience had taught him that luck was a fickle companion at best. They urged their horses down the slope and onto the road, picking up speed on the smooth, packed earth. The animals, sensing the urgency of their riders, stretched out into a ground-eating gallop, hooves thundering on the hard surface. The sun was low in the western sky, painting the landscape in golden amber when they finally reached the outskirts of Redemption. The town seemed unusually quiet for late afternoon. Few people moved on the streets, and those who did hurried along with heads down, avoiding eye contact. "Something's wrong," Isaiah murmured as they slowed their lathered horses to a walk. "Town feels like it's holding its breath." Jackson nodded, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. They proceeded cautiously down the main street toward the courthouse where Judge Hollister would be holding the circuit court. As they approached, they saw a small crowd gathered outside the building, voices raised in what sounded like protest. "Can't just close the court," a man was saying as they drew near. "I've waited 3 months for my case to be heard." The deputy standing on the courthouse steps looked uncomfortable. "Judge's orders, Mr. Barnes. Court suspended until tomorrow at the earliest." "Some kind of emergency?" another man demanded. "What kind of emergency? We've got business needs settling." Jackson and Isaiah exchanged glances. A suspended court session was unusual, especially for the circuit judge whose time in each town was strictly limited. "Stay with the horses," Jackson told Isaiah. "I'll find out what's happening." He dismounted and approached the deputy, who eyed him warily. The young man, Simmons, Jackson recalled his name, was new to the area, having joined Sheriff Haynes's office only a few months ago. "Simmons?" Jackson greeted him. "What's going on? Where's Judge Hollister?" The deputy shifted nervously. "Mr. Blackwood, didn't expect to see you in town." His eyes darted around as if looking for eavesdroppers. "Judge is at the hotel. Took sick suddenly after lunch. Doctor's with him now." Jackson's medical instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of sickness? Symptoms?" Simmons shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Started vomiting during the afternoon session. Sheriff Haynes had him moved to the hotel to rest." A cold suspicion formed in Jackson's mind. "And where's the sheriff now?" "At the hotel with the judge," Simmons replied. "Said I was to keep folks away. Tell them court's suspended until further notice." Jackson thanked the deputy and returned to Isaiah, quickly relaying what he had learned. "Convenient timing," Isaiah observed grimly. "Judge falls ill just as we're bringing evidence against the most powerful man in the county." "Too convenient," Jackson agreed. "We need to see Judge Hollister ourselves, determine if this illness is natural or induced." They tethered their horses at the hitching rail outside the Redemption Hotel, a 2-story building that was the town's finest accommodation. Inside, the lobby was deserted save for the clerk behind the desk, who looked up nervously as they entered. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, recognition and unease in his voice. "What brings you to town?" "Heard Judge Hollister is ill," Jackson replied. "I was a doctor before I was a rancher. Thought I might offer my assistance." The clerk hesitated, clearly torn between turning them away and allowing a doctor to help an important visitor. Finally, he nodded. "Room 203, top of the stairs. Sheriff Haynes is with him now." Jackson and Isaiah climbed the stairs, alert for any sign of trouble. The corridor on the second floor was quiet, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps as they approached room 203. Jackson knocked firmly. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and Sheriff Haynes's weathered face appeared. His eyes widened at the sight of Jackson and Isaiah. "Blackwood Freeman," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What in blazes are you doing here?" "Heard the judge is ill," Jackson said evenly. "I'm offering my medical expertise." Haynes's expression was guarded. "That's kind of you, but Dr. Hines is already attending him." "Two opinions are better than one in serious cases," Jackson pressed. "And I've had experience with unusual poisons during the war." Something flickered in Haynes's eyes. Alarm, recognition, or perhaps guilt. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said quietly, "but the judge is resting." The hotel room was spacious but dim, heavy curtains drawn across the windows despite the fading daylight outside. On the large bed lay a figure that Jackson assumed was Judge Hollister, though it was hard to make out details in the gloom. A second man, presumably Dr. Hines, sat in a chair by the bedside. As Jackson's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could see that the judge was a man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His face was flushed, his breathing labored. A basin on the nightstand suggested he had indeed been vomiting. "Dr. Hines," Sheriff Haynes said, "this is Dr. Jackson Blackwood, formerly of the Union Medical Corps. He's offered to consult on Judge Hollister's case." Dr. Hines stood, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. "Blackwood, I've heard of you. Didn't know you were still practicing." "I'm not, officially," Jackson admitted, moving to the bedside. "But I keep my hand in. May I examine the patient?" Hines hesitated, then stepped aside with a slight shrug. "Be my guest. I've diagnosed acute gastritis, possibly from something he ate at lunch. He's been given laudanum for the pain and to help him rest." Jackson nodded and began a careful examination of the judge, noting the symptoms: elevated pulse, dilated pupils, dry mouth, flushed skin. The pattern was familiar from his wartime experience. "Has he been delirious?" Jackson asked. "Hallucinations, confusion, some," Hines acknowledged. "He was quite agitated earlier, insisted someone was trying to poison him." The doctor gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Common paranoia with this type of gastric distress." Jackson exchanged a glance with Isaiah, who stood quietly by the door, his presence seemingly forgotten by Haynes and Hines. The ranch manager gave a slight nod, confirming he had noted the same suspicious elements. "Dr. Hines," Jackson said carefully, "are you familiar with the effects of Datura stramonium?" "Jimson weed?" Hines frowned. "The plant?" "Of course. Causes delirium, elevated heart rate, dilated pupils." His eyes widened as he made the connection to the judge's symptoms. "Oh, you think he's been poisoned with Jimson weed?" "It would explain the symptoms," Jackson said, "and it's readily available in this region. A tincture in his food or drink would be difficult to detect by taste." Sheriff Haynes stepped forward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his holstered revolver. "That's a serious accusation of Blackwood. Are you suggesting someone deliberately poisoned Judge Hollister?" "I'm suggesting it's a possibility that should be investigated," Jackson replied evenly, "especially given the timing." "Timing?" Hines asked, confused. Jackson straightened, fixing Haynes with a direct gaze. "Sheriff, we need to speak privately. It concerns Nathaniel Crawford and a matter of grave importance." Haynes's expression hardened. "Crawford again. Blackwood, you're becoming obsessed with the man. He's a respected businessman, a pillar of this community." "He's also trafficking children," Jackson said bluntly. "We have evidence, witnesses. 13 children who were held captive, including the girl I found after the wagon attack. We were bringing them to Judge Hollister today when our wagon broke down." The revelation landed like a bombshell in the quiet room. Dr. Hines gasped, his hand rising to cover his mouth. Sheriff Haynes's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, a calculating assessment. "Where are these children now?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jackson hesitated, suddenly aware that he had no idea where Haynes's true loyalties lay. The sheriff had always seemed fair, but in a town where Crawford's influence touched everything. "They're safe," Jackson said, choosing his words with care. "Under guard. We came ahead to bring the judge to them, or to arrange safe passage to town." Haynes nodded slowly. "And now you think Crawford poisoned the judge to prevent him from hearing this evidence?" It's a theory that fits the facts, Jackson acknowledged. A long silence followed. Then from the bed came a weak voice. A theory I'm inclined to believe. All eyes turned to Judge Hollister, who had pushed himself to a sitting position, his face pale with effort. Despite his weakness, there was steel in his gaze that suggested a man used to command. "Your Honor," Dr. Hines exclaimed, "you should be resting." The judge waved away the concern. Hard to rest when one suspects attempted murder. He focused on Jackson. "You're Blackwood, the doctor who became a recluse. I remember hearing about you." Jackson approached the bed. "Judge Hollister, I apologize for the abrupt intrusion, but time is critical. There are 13 children hidden in the hills outside town, all victims of a trafficking operation run by Nathaniel Crawford. They include witnesses who can identify him directly. One child bears his brand on her shoulder." Hollister's bushy white eyebrows rose. "A brand? Like cattle?" "Or slaves," Isaiah spoke up from near the door. The judge's expression darkened. "I fought against slavery in the war, Mr. Isaiah Freeman, Your Honor." Hollister nodded. "Freeman, if what you and Mr. Blackwood allege is true, this is indeed a grave matter, one that requires immediate action." He turned to Sheriff Haynes. "What say you, Sheriff? You know these men? Are they trustworthy?" Haynes looked torn, his gaze moving between the judge, Jackson, and Isaiah. Finally, he sighed. "Blackwood keeps to himself mostly, but he's got no reason to lie about something like this. Freeman's solid. If they say they found trafficked children, I believe them." He paused. "But Crawford is powerful, Your Honor. He has friends in the territorial capital, connections in Denver and beyond." "I don't give a damn if he has connections to the president himself," Hollister said, his voice suddenly stronger. "If he's trafficking children, he'll hang." He swung at his legs over the side of the bed. "Help me up. We need to secure these children and their testimony." "Your Honor," Hines protested, "you're in no condition to travel. The poison will have to run its course." "And I'll be damned if I let it prevent me from doing my duty," Hollister shot back. He looked at Jackson. "Can you provide an antidote, doctor?" Jackson shook his head regretfully. "There's no specific antidote for Jimson weed poisoning, but I can administer activated charcoal to help absorb any poison still in your system, and atropine belladonna to counter some of the effects." "Do it," Hollister ordered, "and then we ride. Sheriff Haynes, gather your deputies, only those you trust implicitly. No word of this is to reach Crawford or his associates." Haynes hesitated. "Your Honor, if Crawford is behind this poisoning, he already knows something's afoot. The moment we start gathering a force, he'll be alerted." "Then we must move swiftly," the judge said, struggling to his feet despite Dr. Hines's protests. "Blackwood, how far to where the children are hidden?" "About 3 hours by horseback," Jackson replied, "in a hollow north of the main road. Mrs. Reed, the school teacher, and a Pinkerton agent named Pierce are guarding them." Hollister nodded, swaying slightly but remaining upright through sheer force of will. "We leave within the hour. Sheriff, gather 5 men you trust with your life. Dr. Blackwood will prepare whatever medical treatment I need for the journey." He fixed Jackson with a penetrating gaze. "I want to hear everything about this trafficking operation, every detail. By the time we reach those children, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." As Haynes departed to gather his men and Jackson began preparing a charcoal mixture for the judge, Isaiah moved to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain. "Jackson," he said quietly, "we have company." Jackson joined Isaiah at the window, carefully peering around the edge of the curtain. In the street below, 4 riders had pulled up outside the hotel. Even from this distance, Jackson recognized Crawford's distinctive chestnut stallion. "Crawford and 3 of his men," Jackson said quietly, drawing back from the window. "They must have followed us from the ranch." Judge Hollister struggled to his feet, brushing aside Dr. Hines's protests. "We need to move now, gentlemen. Is there a back way out of this hotel?" Sheriff Haynes nodded. "Service entrance through the kitchen. My deputies can meet us there." "I'll create a distraction," Jackson decided. "Isaiah, get the judge to safety and gather the men. I'll meet you at the livery stable in 10 minutes. Isaiah's dark eyes showed concern. "That's risky, Jackson." "I've faced worse odds," Jackson replied, checking his revolver. "Crawford won't expect me to confront him directly. That gives me an advantage. Judge Hollister gripped Jackson's arm with surprising strength for a man who'd been poisoned. Don't do anything foolish, Blackwood. We need you alive to testify against Crawford. Jackson nodded, but his mind was already calculating the moves ahead. While Isaiah and Haynes escorted the judge down the back stairs, Jackson moved to the window and deliberately opened the curtains. It took only moments for one of Crawford's men to spot him. The banker's head jerked up at something his henchman said, and his cold eyes locked with Jackson's across the distance. Jackson's smile was deliberate, a challenge. Then he stepped away from the window. Downstairs, he walked calmly through the hotel lobby as Crawford and his men burst through the front doors. Blackwood! Crawford's voice cut through the sudden silence. Where are you going in such a hurry? Jackson turned slowly. Crawford, fancy meeting you here. Where's the girl? Crawford demanded, hand hovering near his pistol. The lobby had emptied quickly, guests and staff vanishing at the first sign of trouble. Safe, Jackson replied. Beyond your reach. Crawford's smile was cold. Woman is beyond my reach in this territory, not even the mighty Jackson Blackwood. Perhaps, Jackson acknowledged, but children aren't merchandise, Crawford. They're not cattle to be branded and sold. A flicker of surprise crossed the banker's face. So you've been to the mine, impressive, but it changes nothing. You have no real evidence, no witnesses that anyone would believe over me. I have 13 children with your brand on their shoulders, Jackson countered, and Judge Hollister is very interested in hearing their testimony. At the mention of the judge, Crawford's composure cracked. Hollister should be incapacitated by now. Your poison wasn't as effective as you hoped, Jackson said. The judge is quite lucid and quite angry. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, but Jackson was faster. The silver Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic. I wouldn't, Jackson warned. Even if your men kill me, you'll hang. The evidence is secure, the children protected. It's over, Crawford. For a moment, it seemed Crawford might stand down. Then with snake-like speed, he drew and fired in one motion. Jackson felt the bullet tug at his coat as he dove behind a marble pillar, returning fire as he moved. One of Crawford's men fell, clutching his chest. Another bullet splintered the wood beside Jackson's head as he rolled to another position. The gunfight was chaotic, confined in the elegant hotel lobby. Mirrors shattered, a chandelier crashed to the floor, plaster dust filled the air. Through the haze, Jackson saw Crawford fleeing toward the back of the hotel. Ignoring the remaining gunmen, Jackson gave chase. Crawford knew too much about the trafficking operation, information that could save countless other children. He couldn't let him escape. He caught up to Crawford in the hotel kitchen. The banker had a young kitchen boy as a shield, gun pressed to the child's temple. Let the boy go, Crawford, Jackson said, his voice deadly calm. This is between us. Drop your gun or I'll kill him, Crawford snarled, backing toward the door. Jackson locked eyes with the frightened boy. What's your name, son? Tommy, sir, the boy stammered. Tommy, I need you to be brave, Jackson said quietly. When I count to 3, drop straight down. Can you do that? The boy gave the slightest nod, his eyes never leaving Jackson's face. 1, Jackson began, his voice steady. 2. On 2, Crawford's eyes flickered in anticipation, the opening Jackson needed. His shot was precise, striking Crawford's shoulder. The banker's arm jerked, his gun discharging into the ceiling as Tommy dropped to the floor. Crawford staggered back, clutching his bleeding shoulder, then turned and fled through the back door. Jackson helped Tommy to his feet. You're very brave, he told the boy. Now find somewhere safe to hide. Outside, Crawford was mounting his horse. Jackson fired a warning shot that spooked the animal, sending Crawford tumbling to the ground. His fine suit now covered in mud, the banker scrambled to his feet, drawing a hidden derringer. It's over, Crawford, Jackson said. Nothing's over, Crawford sneered. You have no idea how far this goes, Blackwood. Powerful men across 3 territories are involved. Kill me, and they'll send others. Then you'll stand trial and name them, Jackson replied. Save yourself the noose by turning evidence. Crawford's laugh was bitter. There's no redemption for men like me. His eyes shifted to something behind Jackson, and none for you either. Jackson sensed the movement too late. Pain exploded across the back of his head. As darkness claimed him, he saw Pierce standing over him, gun raised for another blow. When Jackson regained consciousness, he was bound in the back of a moving wagon. Crawford and Pierce sat across from him, watching his return to awareness. "The great Jackson Blackwood," Crawford mocked. "All that money, and here you are, helpless as a newborn." Jackson tested his bonds, tight, professional. "You've been working for Crawford all along," he said to Pierce. The supposed Pinkerton agent shrugged. "Business is business. The Harrisons were getting too close. Crawford paid better." "What about the children?" Jackson asked. "Sophie?" "Loose ends," Crawford said dismissively. "Being tied up as we speak." Cold fury washed through Jackson. "If you harm Sophie or any of those children—" "You'll what?" Crawford laughed. "You'll be dead within the hour, Blackwood. We're taking you somewhere quiet to finish this." Jackson's mind raced. Sophie, Abigail, the children, all still at the camp, waiting for his return with help. If Pierce had betrayed them— The wagon hit a rut, jostling everyone. Jackson noticed Crawford grimace, his wounded shoulder clearly causing him pain. Pierce seemed distracted, scanning the road ahead. Neither man was paying close attention to their prisoner. Slowly, Jackson worked his hands against the ropes. During the war, he'd learned various methods of escape from Confederate captors. It would take time, but the knots were already loosening. "You made one mistake, Crawford," Jackson said conversationally, working at his bonds behind his back. "And what's that?" the banker asked contemptuously. "You assumed I came to town alone." As if on cue, riders appeared on the road ahead. Sheriff Haynes, Isaiah, and 4 deputies blocked the way, rifles raised. "Blackwood," Isaiah called. "You in there?" Before Crawford or Pierce could respond, Jackson broke free of his bonds and lunged forward, tackling Pierce. The wagon swerved wildly as the driver tried to turn around. Crawford raised his good arm, a pistol glinting in the late afternoon sun. Jackson knocked it aside as the first shot went wide. They grappled in the confined space of the moving wagon, each struggling for control of the weapon. When the gun discharged again, Crawford looked surprised. He glanced down at the spreading crimson stain on his expensive waistcoat, then back at Jackson. "My father always said I'd come to a bad end," he whispered, before slumping back. The wagon finally stopped as Haynes and his men surrounded it. Isaiah helped Jackson down, concern evident in his face. "You're bleeding," he observed, pointing to Jackson's temple. "Just a graze," Jackson dismissed it. "We need to get back to the camp. Pierce betrayed us. The children are in danger." The ride back to the camp was the longest of Jackson's life. When they finally reached the hollow where they'd left the children, he feared the worst. But the scene that greeted them was unexpected. Abigail Reed stood with a rifle in her hands, keeping watch over 3 bound men, Crawford's henchmen, sent to tie up loose ends. The children were safe, huddled together, but unharmed. Sophie ran to Jackson the moment she saw him, flinging herself into his arms. "You came back," she said, holding him tight. "I promised I would," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Later, after the prisoners had been taken to town and Judge Hollister had heard the children's testimony, Jackson stood on the porch of Sundown Ranch watching the sunset. The past week had been a whirlwind of depositions, court proceedings, and arrangements for the children. Some, like Daniel, had been reunited with families who had been searching for them. Others, with no families to return to, had been placed with carefully vetted foster parents throughout the territory. Victoria had received the greatest shock. One of the rescued boys was her son Miguel, taken 8 years earlier, now almost a young man, but recognizable by a distinctive birthmark and the overwhelming joy of their reunion. Sophie appeared beside Jackson, leaning against the porch railing. "Is it really over?" she asked. "Crawford can't hurt anyone anymore," Jackson assured her, "and his associates have been arrested. Pierce will stand trial too." "And I can stay here? Forever?" Jackson knelt before her. "Sophie, I've filed papers with Judge Hollister. If you want, you can legally be Sophie Blackwood, my daughter." Her smile was like the sunrise. "I'd like that very much." "So would I," came another voice. Abigail Reed stood in the doorway, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Over the past days, she had become a constant presence at Sundown Ranch, helping with the children and, increasingly, becoming something more to Jackson. "Mrs. Reed has agreed to stay on as your teacher," Jackson explained to Sophie, "and perhaps in time as something more to both of us." The light blush that colored Abigail's cheeks confirmed his words. Sophie looked between them, her expression suddenly serious. I would like that too, she decided, but I'll always remember my other parents. Both sets of them. Of course you will, Jackson agreed. They're part of who you are. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Jackson and Abigail sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Isaiah and Victoria had retired for the evening, leaving them in comfortable silence. What happens now? Abigail asked finally. Jackson considered the question. For 7 years, he had existed rather than lived, allowing grief to wall him off from the world. Now that wall had crumbled, leaving him both vulnerable and strangely free. Now we build something new, he said, taking her hand in his. A family, a future. From such darkness, she mused, such light can emerge. Jackson looked toward the window of Sophie's room where a single lamp still burned. The child who had come into his life by chance had given him back his purpose, his heart. In saving her, he had saved himself. Yes, he agreed simply. Light from darkness, life from loss. He squeezed Abigail's hand gently. A second chance. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, guiding lost travelers home. And at Sundown Ranch, Jackson Blackwood was finally, truly home.